All right, we are going to start, if you don't mind. I was hoping for more people in the audience. However, anyway, well, we'll be together and it's going to be an intimate meeting. Welcome to the sit-up. Thank you so much for being amongst us today. Today's topic, I think that it's very important to us. And news, today we wake up this morning, I think, that render more relevance to this event. I'd like to introduce both speakers very briefly in such a way they will be able to start their keynote speech, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. Stanislav Secreriu, he is one of the main specialists, one of the youngest specialists. He's a brilliant specialist in Europe. He's from Moldova, Republic of Moldova. Therefore, he's got a European vision from Eastern Europe and from European side that was the former Soviet Union, and it's not anymore. And as you know, well, right now, it is suffering a very delicate situation for their security and sovereignty, mainly after the war against Ukraine. Stanislav, he is a senior analyst at the European Institute of Security Studies. It is the institute that feeds and offers loads of ideas, also makes some analysis and offers loads of data to the European institutions and to the broader public. Stanislav published a few months ago, before the war, a very detailed and exhaustive study. Exhaustive in the sense that really deals with loads of the fields of Russian activity, about the presence and the strategy of Russia in Latin America. Thus, his intervention and presentation is going to deal with the final results of the analysis. To have a conversation together with him and to discuss with him, we have Ana Ayuso, our main Latin America specialist, and she's going to complete the vision made by Stanislav, but from an internal Latin American perspective, which is the reality that she knows better. Therefore, we have a great occasion, a magnificent opportunity. We have a marvelous opportunity to take advantage of both the complementary perspectives that are and will be very fruitful. And we would like to divide these interventions in three main bullet points. The first bullet point will talk about the state of the art in Latin America, the Russian presence in Latin America. The second bullet point would be about the impact that the war and the aggression against Ukraine, what has happened in Latin America and in the Russian strategy. And in the end, also we'll talk about consequences and the forecasts that we can make and the perspectives that are between this relationship between Latin America and Russia. With any further to add, and I'd like to give the floor to Stanislav. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Carmen, for kind introduction. And first, it's really a pleasure to be in amazing Barcelona, and I would like to thank CDOP for putting this event together. And without limitless energy and kind Carmen, it would not be possible. So thanks a lot. Let me sum up what Russia did in the Latin America, what they achieved, their objectives before full-scale invasion of Ukraine of February 24. And I think it's important because we will show what continues and what discontinues since the beginning of this stage of war. Well, if I think about objectives of Russian Federation, before the war. To an extent, it was a byproduct of Russian policy towards the United States. In Russian thinking, Latin America is American soft underbelly. And Russia was aiming to create a feeling of vulnerability for the United States. The perception was that US creates troubles for Russia in the post-Soviet space. We will do the same. It will be tit for tat. And you can see several activities in this field. You have strategic bombers flying nearby. You have some Navy visits to Cuba, to Nicaragua or Venezuela. Some arms supplies as well. And then assistance to avoid sanctions, which makes American policy in the Latin America much more costly and less effective. Second element of Russian policy before the war was to widen the divisions between European Union and United States. Because even if allies, both have different interpretations sometimes of what happens in the Latin America and how best to pursue interests in the region. And from Russian point of view, it's much better to deal with divided transatlantic community and with divided European Union than to deal with united alliance. It gives them much more opportunities to achieve interests in the relationship with Europe or United States. Another important element or objective of Russia was to offset the effects of their policy in the post-Soviet region. For instance, after Russia annexed Crimea, there was an important vote in the UN in 2014. What was essential for Russia was not to be alone when the vote takes place. And of course, they recruited their clients in Latin America to vote against the resolution. Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela, usual suspects. It's interesting that the big three countries in Latin America, like Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, they abstained during the vote in 2014. It gives Russia kind of a possibility to say that they are not alone, they are not isolated. Others have a similar opinion. As well, in 2014, there was an attempt to isolate diplomatically Russia. Some important visits to Latin America gave impression that Russia has a wide reception around the world, and when there were visits to Latin America, they would have a red carpet reception for President Putin back in 2014. But as well, if you remember, in 2014, in response to the sanctions introduced by European Union, Russia declared a food embargo, partial food embargo. But it created problems for Russia because there was a shortage of several types of fruits and vegetables, and the prices for food went up. As a result, they sought more imports of fruits and vegetables from Latin America. For instance, Ecuador is the second biggest exporter of fruits to Russia after Turkey. Yeah? Obviously, bananas dominate as an item of exports. And then, of course, Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Chile were important to compensate for shortage of meat, fish, and soybean products. So that was important for Russia, Latin America, helping to offset negative impact of Russian policy in the post-Soviet space. Then we, as well, thanks to investigative journalists, discovered that Latin America, or Caribbean region in general, was a place where Russian elites were hiding their money. We don't know whether these legal or illegal assets, but investigative journalists revealed that some people close to leadership of Russia were hiding assets, and we know it from Panama Papers. And then I think the last big motivating factor for Russia to engage in Latin America was to find export markets for products machines or Russian technologies which are not competitive on other markets. Just to give you example, Russian atom company which constructs nuclear power plants, Rosatom, was looking for opportunities in Latin America. As well, Russia been active in exporting helicopters. Some countries in Latin America are biggest owners of Russian or Soviet-produced helicopters. And as well, export of petrochemical products. We know already now that there is a shortage of fertilizers in Latin America because we're among biggest importers of this type of products. So for Russia, Latin America was, for certain companies, it was attractive export market, but as well important market to access some rare earth materials or resources, like lithium. And Russia tried to buy a stake in lithium explorations in Chile in 2019, but also investments in oil and gas businesses in Venezuela. Well, what Russia managed to achieve, so we have seen these objectives which drove Russian policy at least before the war. Perfect, 5 minutes. I would say that to sum up, because so many experts rush to write about Russia, it's obviously that Russia achieved a visibility in the region. They've disappeared in the 90s when Soviet Union collapsed. There were no resources, there was no diplomatic and political will to engage with the region. Now, or at least before, everyone was saying Russia is back to the region. Although it was disputed how big is the comeback. Sometimes Russia was overselling their presence. It was smaller than it was presented often by Russian government. True, Russia managed to get some votes which helped to preserve the appearance that Russia is not isolated on the international stage. Some countries even recognized annexation of Crimea, like Nicaragua. And I think for Russia it was not so much attempt to gather many states which vote against, but to have a bunch of them just to say that we are not alone. It was enough. And to a certain extent, Russia even encouraged, if you don't vote against the resolution, at least abstain or don't show up. Because in the final argument from Russian diplomats, you often hear, oh, but look how many voted for the resolution. It's not an impressive number. It's only half of it. So it helped a bit Russia to dilute this impression that the world condemned the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Russia as well managed to rebuild a relationship with former clients, where Soviet Union was very active. Russia managed to rebuild the relationship with Nicaragua and Cuba, and also develop a pretty dynamic relationship with Venezuela, which was not its Soviet client. It's a new area for Russian policy and diplomacy. And it was pretty successful in terms of arms exports to Venezuela, but also to help Venezuela avoid sanctions in a duet with Iran. As well, Russia managed to increase trade turnover with Latin America. So it went from about a bit more than 5 billion in 2010, it went to around 14 billion in 2019. So we doubled the trade turnover with Latin America. However, it's insignificant in comparison to trade turnover US has with Latin America, China, or European Union. It represents around 0.7% of entire trade of Latin America. So yes, they managed to rebuild their trade relationship, but in comparative terms, it's still insignificant. Where it's significant in several critical sectors, and I mentioned fertilizers. It remains very critical for several countries in Latin America. I think they made the progress in expanding the system or alternative, as they try to sell it, to global positioning system or GPS. A Russian alternative is called GLONASS. And they've been trying to create several sites in Latin America in order to make this system work. We have seen as well that they've been pretty successful in amplifying anti-Western message in the information space in the Latin America. I wouldn't say that Russia was at the origin of anti-Western feelings in the Latin America. They are there even before. In Latin America, there is a skepticism towards military interventions. There is a strong tradition of respecting international public law. So it's there. And of course, mistakes committed by Western powers created this kind of negative attitudes. But Russia, through RT, its television, which works as well in Spanish, and also radio, Sputnik, was able to amplify these negative sentiments. So they were not out of origin, but they were amplifying these sentiments. And I think the last interesting point is that Russia made the entry in Latin America via security elites as well. Russia launched different training programs, combating drug trafficking, preparing military, which gave them the access to security elites in Latin America, in some countries, where security elites and military elites are playing not the last role sometimes in politics. I think I will stop here with my summary and will be glad to continue.
That's perfect timing. So, Ana, please.
Sí.
The state
Bueno, voy a intentar
el
complementar.
estado de la cuestión.
What's the state of the art, Anna? Yes, it was so complete. It was very, very complete, your perspective, Stanislav. I'd like to complete some details, because the main things, please try to speak slowly for the translation. Can you hear the translation? Yes, okay. Do you get the translation? Okay. So the vision of Latin America, it's not an homogeneous, obviously. They are very different countries, different circumstances. It is not the same division that some countries have compared with other countries. And it changes the perspective relying on the political positions. So it's not the same vision that the left-wing parties have or the right parties have. In Latin America, we can see the image still alive of the former USSR. The left-wing parties, they still have as a reference some of the socialist ideals, and in the right-wing parties, they see Russia as a communist reference, as an ally of Chavez, and such as Venezuela and Nicaragua. So, in such a way, there are still the remainings, despite Russia has nothing to do with the former USSR, and well, it has to do for sure, but the position is completely different. But in the feeling, in the mindset, in the vision that Latin America has and the different society layers, they still have these visions. But in any case, for Latin America, Russia, it is not seen as a threat. It is a very faraway country that doesn't have a very strong presence in the field in Latin America, in that geography. So Russia, it's not seen as a stakeholder, as an actor that, well, tries to erode sovereignty. For Latin America, the empire, for the sector of Latin America, the imperialism only comes from the US. And from some specific sectors, that feeling related with the ingerence that the US executed in the region, it is compensated in some cases with some, well, friendship towards those actors that go against hegemony in the international arena. In any case, as you brilliantly said, Stanislav, Russia, the Russian presence, it's very low, quite low. But it's focused in some strategic points. Militarily speaking, the presence, militarily speaking, the Russian presence, it's very limited, right? It has some cooperation strategies, but they don't have a physical, they don't have a military bases in Latin America. They do have collaborations with some armies. From a trade perspective, despite we can see a growth, it is, we are at the beginning and it's very marginal. Russia is very focused in strategic sectors, and for some countries are very important, such as the fertilizers, as you mentioned before. They are very important for the food production, mainly for meat and cattle production. And above everything, this is something very worrisome, it is a good provider for weapons and arms for some countries. I wanted to talk about different sectors, such as the helicopter sectors that you mentioned before. The helicopters that sold to Mexico, they sold lots of helicopters. They are trying to give back the helicopters, the Mexican, because they do not work. Come on. So this is a problem, right? That's a problem, and it is tricky. Russia can be very competitive. Some things could not be sold to other countries, but in some Latin American countries, they are realizing that they can be price competitive, but not from a technological perspective. So Russia has limitations when having a higher level of trade in Latin America. But there are some sectors, those that have to do with commodities and fuel. That's where Russia is able to penetrate and took advantage of these different niches. Talking about politics, when we talk about politics, what Russia made was, let's say, in such a way, they took advantage of the U.S. mistakes committed in the region. U.S. for many, many years abandoned Latin America, and it made the region in a way of a courtyard, right? That you have, they are friends, there are enemies in these courtyards that created a polarization amongst countries and inside the countries, and it produced a fragmentation of cooperation in the region. Those divisions were appropriated by Russia to increase its presence, being an ally of the countries that defy U.S. hegemony, such as Venezuela. Russia was the traditional partner, and after that Nicaragua, and well, Bolivia as well, in other well, activities, and also Ecuador in a very specific period of time. And we'll talk about it later. Well, Argentina in a different way, and Brazil, but in a different manner. So basically, Russia was concentrated in those countries, the countries where Russia can have a certain influence, because, as you very well mentioned, Stanislav, they are like a saver against U.S. sanctions, right? And that's a huge mistake from the U.S. perspective. The United States was not able to sanction that. To sanction those countries increased the hate and victimism speech. It's obvious, and it really fit the anti-Americanism. And on the other hand, Russia, well, tried to be softer when getting into bigger countries, the most important countries such as Brazil. Obviously, Brazil, it is the main trade partner with Russia, maybe in a very low level, but after Venezuela, it's the main trade partner, Mexico and Argentina. Russia also took advantage of this pink wave of Latin America, let's say the left-wing parties that, well, they felt like friends towards those image of Marxism, a Russian period, and they took advantage, Russia took advantage of this friendship to get closer and to offer to those countries that were seeking bigger international presence and diversification, and they wanted to be more important in this multipolar world, to set some alliances with countries. With some countries, Russia had more success. Maybe the BRICS operation was the most successful one. Well, they were able to attract China, India, Brazil, and South Africa in the BRICS countries, and they were able to create another decision pole and another pole that, well, tried to stop this polarity amongst China and the US. For BRICS countries, very important that concept. It began during Lula, but also Bolsonaro boosted it isn't, and some Bolsonaro sectors, they carried on giving support to that vision. It is a new way to, let's say, to position in a way that, well, it will become an international actor, maybe not a global power, but also maybe as a regional power. So, with Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico, with those countries, Russia wanted to have some relationships through trade, mainly through trade and diplomacy. And lately, before the war, in that multilateral diplomacy, which is something very new, through the Euro-Asian Economic Union, they signed a memorandum of understanding with Mercosur and bilaterally beyond Cuba, and also with Chile, Peru, and Ecuador. So they are able to get inside and to penetrate not only through bilateralism but also through multilateralism. Dear Anna, just 5 minutes. Okay. In order to conclude, let me just tell you that basically what really fed this proximity of Russia towards Latin America, it's not only the trade interest, it's very limited, nothing to do with China, but the tentative of Russia to look for non-active alignment. I don't have to choose amongst China or Russia. I do have more ability to be more open. I do have a relationship with other stakeholders and actors such as Russia, Turkey, Iran, and many other countries, right? So it was based in two principles that you said. The non-intervention principle, which is basic for Latin America, and equally sovereignty. These are the basic principles for Latin American countries. And we'll see later when we talk about it, this is the main narrative that they offered for their position while facing the Ukrainian war. Thank you so much, Anna. All right, now we are going to face the impact of the war in Ukraine and what's the situation today, the relationships and the Russian strategy in Latin America. Please.
Thank you. Look, we are almost 7 months into the Russian full-scale invasion. Yeah? We can have already preliminary assessment of how relations were affected in which way, or which things which Russia was doing before we did even more. Yeah? For instance, Russia was actively recruiting support in the UN to vote against resolutions on Ukraine. It was not very successful at the first 2 resolutions because nobody from Latin America voted against, unlike in 2014 on annexation of Crimea. And notably, 3 big countries from Latin America, Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico, voted for both 2 resolutions. It was a better vote for Russia for the recent resolution, whether to give to President Zelensky chance to address United Nations General Assembly online or via internet. And in this case, we have seen that Nicaragua and Cuba voted against. What was interesting is Russian, another client, Venezuela, which probably benefited the most, didn't show up or abstained. Yeah. No, they didn't even come to vote.
No, because he's suspended. Yes, because they don't pay the quota.
Okay, I had no idea. What was interesting is that Argentina and Mexico voted for, and Brazil abstained. It's significant because Brazil now holds the non-permanent member of Security Council position. And I think Russia will be engaged in these diplomatic duels because there will be illegal referendums to legitimize the military takeover of the territories of Ukraine, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Luhansk, in the coming days. And I assume that there will be a resolution in the UN to react to this next wave of illegal annexations. What we are going to see is the continuation of this duel, diplomatic, for the votes, and I think Latin American countries will be among those who will be targeted. Another interesting point is that if in 2014 we have seen after annexation of Crimea some high-level visits of President Putin or Minister of Foreign Affairs Lavrov to Latin America, we haven't seen in 7 months any high-level visit of a Russian representative to Latin America. It's interesting they travel to Africa, but not yet to Latin America. It's interesting as well in the context that 2 presidents, Argentina and Brazil, visited Putin several days before the war in Moscow. Yeah. I don't have a good explanation. Maybe Anna will have this Latin American perspective. But if I would look from Russian perspective, they would love to have a visit. Yeah? Just to reconfirm that they are not isolated. As well, Russia made its connections in the Latin America to prevent exclusion from international financial institutions or weakening of Russian rights within these institutions. And I think there was a public information about Russian ministers appealing to government of Brazil when there were discussions about Russian presence in the international financial institutions. And then you remember probably the debate whether Russia shall come and attend and be part of G20 or not. Yeah? So Russia is trying to push to use any diplomatic contacts in order to minimize the impact of restrictive measures. Bad evolution for Russia. It was excluded as an observer from the Organization of American States. Russia gained the observer status there, but it was excluded, and I think it was a surprise for Russian diplomacy. I don't think that they expected this move. I think another interesting, and I would expect that as a result of and weakening of Russian economy, disruption of transportation infrastructure in Russia, there will be a decline of a trade turnover between Russia and Latin America. So basically, all the achievements over the last decade probably will suffer as a result of economic decline in Russia and many restrictive measures imposed on Russia. I think another interesting thing is that if before Russia was trying to help some countries to avoid or evade sanctions or protect them from sanctions, it's Russia who needs now help to avoid sanctions. And to a certain extent, Russia used Latin America for this purpose. There were public stories when Russian oligarchs were parking their yachts in the Caribbean in order to protect them from being seized by FBI. Yeah. There have been reports that Russia was looking as well to get access to some rare earth materials, and Chile and Argentina refused to sell it. Some countries and companies in Latin America, even if there were no sanctions in that field, engaged in the de-risking behavior, preventing any negative impact on their businesses. Maybe not financial, but reputational. It's interesting, I've been reading in some interviews with Russian entrepreneurs who complained when the moment they've been competing for a contract in Latin American country, and if it would be offer of free, more or less equal partners, they would lose because people would not like to have a company from Russia because it's a very poisonous or very toxic now. Yeah? Even if Russian offer is relatively good, yeah, they would prefer a company from another country. And of course, Russia leveraged fertilizers in order to blame West for negative impact of sanctions, hiding the fact that sanctions were introduced because Russia invaded Ukraine and seized its territory militarily in the first place. Then I think it's very interesting in terms of disruption of trade. There were problems for Ecuador, the biggest exporter of fruits to Russia, to export their fruits. There were complaints from the peasants and farmers from Ecuador that their bananas are destroyed. They cannot then export to Russia because it's impossible to transport goods to Russia. And then second problem is a payment, in which currency you pay and whether banks are willing to serve these payments. Exactly. This is probably the next step, and then I think another impact of war is that Russia actively is trying to promote alternative payment systems or Russian payment cards, so-called MIR. And they've been offering to countries besides or outside of Europe to accept these kind of payments, and especially in rubles. We have seen recently that because of secondary sanctions, some countries refused to do it, or even before accepted, but then they reviewed their decision, like case of Turkey. And I'm skeptical that it will work in Latin America as well, because I think banks and financial institutions there are exposed to American market. And I think US market will be much more important for them if they have to balance their economic interests. We haven't seen a lot of military activity, and I haven't seen, but I suspect that Russia might be involved in several political campaigns in Latin America. They did it before. They've been active in Bolivia, and it's interesting, the political consultancy services were provided and paid by Rosatom, a Russian state company, with economic interests in the country. Well, I don't have a very solid proofs, but I would not be surprised that Russian TV channels operating and radio operating in Latin America, but some also consultants being involved in some political campaigns in Latin America. As we see that there is a left turn again in the region, it's generally perceived in Moscow that people from the left side of a political spectrum in Latin America are easy to deal and work for Russia than with right or center-right parties. It might be not true, but this is how it's perceived in Moscow. And I think I will stop here, yes, and we can continue.
Very good, thank you a lot. Ana, por favor.
Bueno, pues,
Anna, please. Yes, as Stanislav mentioned, there was no unanimity amongst relationships. Mainly, the Russian invasion, has not been seen or welcomed well in Latin America, because the principle of intervention, it is a sacred principle in Latin America. But there are some problems and positions that change. There is an outer language and an inner language that really changes depending on the politicians. In some cases, we had presidents or leaders, left-wing leaders, that said things that were kind of ambiguous, and suddenly you had the Foreign Affairs Ministry that went to the United Nations saying that they were against the invasion. There is like a domestic language and international language from Latin American countries that has to do with domestic policies and the domestic allies that some governments have. In any case, it is true that there were some differences amongst the United Nations and NATO, and the American States Association. And the first resolution of the OEA, Brazil and Argentina, they didn't condemn, but they condemned in the United Nations plenary session in the United Nations some days after. There were some changes in the perspective, and there was a great evolution. And it is quite interesting that presidents that were against, they agree in some issues. It was obvious that Duque, that was the president, it was a right party, was against Russia, Ivan Duque, but it was surprising that presidents such as Boric in Chile, well, is a left-wing president. He was against the Russian invasion. It is a very young leader of the left-wing parties, a very young leader. However, if we see the veteran left-wing parties, the older ones such as Petro and Lula, the attitude was more reluctant to condemn the Russian invasion. They condemned the aggression, they condemned the invasion, they accepted the idea that in reality it was provoked by NATO with attitude against Russia, a belligerent attitude against Russia. So this perspective was accepted inside Latin America in some domestic sectors. In Petro's case, he is now more moderated. He said that it was a war for gas. It was an interest war. Some leaders such as Lula that said that in the end they were not able to have some diplomacy. The war is amongst two parties. No one had negotiations, so it was kind of ambiguity positioning. Despite they condemned the invasion, some of the leaders justified that there were some causes behind the curtains that made this situation appear and provoked this military anti-Russian response. The majority looks for talk and the ceasefire. This was criticized in Ukraine. Mexico wants to bring tomorrow to the United Nations a proposal. They want to propose to create a mediation. They propose to India, the Holy See, and the Vatican and the United Nations as mediators in the conflict. So, you know, the Ukrainian response is a ceasefire. It is to help Russia if we cease fire. And, well, they are not getting the support. So basically the position, those that are aligned straightforward with against the invasion and they are backing Ukraine, suddenly we can see countries that gave support to Ukraine, maybe El Salvador, that was not Venezuela and Bolivia, they gave Nicaragua, and Cuba, for sure they gave support to Russia. Well, they didn't give support. They expressed their abstention. I remember that we were here with a Cuban group of people when the war began, and they said that they never gave support to the invasion. But, well, they justified in the end the reasons why the invasion happened. In any case, well, you know, there is a group of countries that have, let's say, a more ambiguous attitude that, are trying to get protected in the principle of no intervention and the neutrality principle facing the conflict. This is what Macron said in the United Nations session. He said, we cannot be neutral facing these kind of attacks. Well, in reality, the Latin American response towards the Russian invasion, it is an answer and response that show the differences amongst the region, inside the region. Latin America is not able to have a single voice, a unique voice, facing a situation that puts in danger the international status quo. But, however, let me tell you something, that no one gave support to the sanctions. None of the countries, all Latin American countries, were against sanctions because they consider that it's unilateral interference, and many of them, they said openly in the United Nations. That's clear enough. There is kind of a unanimity in the region. Yeah, there is a consensus. And now let's attack the last bullet point, consequences derived from the war and the perspectives that these consequences will produce in this situation that we've described.
Yeah, thank you. I will link to the decisions announced today, with mobilization of Russian troops, referendums, and what does it mean for Russian position in Latin America as well. I think first, today's decision to announce mobilization shows that Russian war in Ukraine goes in the wrong direction for Russia. They are losing this war. They need much more manpower. If I think about Latin America, I don't expect Russia in the near future to have any big military presence in Latin America. The entire military focus is absorbed now by Ukraine. It's Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. At the same time, Russian leadership today used a very dangerous rhetoric about use of nuclear weapons. And probably in order to make sound more credible and to send even a stronger message to Western powers, I wouldn't exclude some flights of strategic bombers or some submarines near the waters of the United States, which some might stop or land in Latin American countries. For instance, Russia has a privileged access to naval facilities in Nicaragua, in Venezuela, and in Cuba. So this would be my one kind of speculation how the decision today may reflect in the region. Russian announcement of mobilization of troops means that they will need even more military equipment. What I expect is that they probably will not be able to deliver on their contracts, any contracts they have with the clients in Latin America. At the same, the priority is that they need the spare parts to repair damaged equipment. Probably they will not be even service or serve or maintain the equipment which is already in Latin America used by law enforcement or national armies. The priority will be everything for the war in Ukraine. As sanctions of European Union enter into the force beginning December, banning Russian oil and petroleum products in February, I expect Russia will try to sell what they cannot sell in Europe to other clients. Their preferred clients were China and India. I don't rule out that they will try to send more petroleum products to Latin America as well. I don't know how the sanctions will work and whether there will be preoccupation of the secondary sanctions by the clients in Latin America, but this is one thing to expect. Russia has to offset the losses of European market and European market revenues which sale of oil and gas generated. I think another thing to expect from Russia is escalation of political warfare, disinformation. It's cheap and they can do it. It doesn't cost that much. Plus, RT, Sputnik, Spanish reach not only audiences in Latin America, but also Spanish-speaking citizens of the United States. There will be elections, and probably they will leverage even more the Spanish-speaking media assets to a certain extent, get involved and influence the presidential campaign in the United States. Another thing which I would expect is, I think Russian diplomacy still will try to secure some high-level visits. It's really important for leadership. It's symbolic and it's important. We have seen how desperate Russian leadership was in Samarkand with meetings to show that we are not isolated, even if the vis-a-vis made President Putin to wait, violating the tradition of the last 10 years when other people were waiting for president. Yeah. So even at this, even in these circumstances,
an amazing situation.
In diplomacy everything matters. Even in these circumstances, it's still important for them to have this kind of meetings, and they will try to secure such kind of meetings with leadership of Latin American countries. And yeah, I think there is a credible expectation as well that Russia would encourage any peace proposals including coming from local stakeholders in Latin America, because this is what Russia needs. Russia needs a ceasefire. When you do mobilization, the military effects appear free, or in the best case scenario, in 6 months. Yeah? You have to mobilize, to train, to equip, prepare, so it takes time. And I think in the meantime, in the next 3 to 6 months, on the one hand, Russia doesn't want openly to say that they want a ceasefire, yeah? Because it would be a public sign of weakness. But I think they will encourage others to propose these kind of initiatives. And in these circumstances, it will be only prolongation of the war and not a ceasefire which leads to a sustainable peace. Because Russia will use it in order to reinforce militarily, in order to take even more territory, or if they can, to change government in Kyiv, which is ultimate objective. So these are a bit my speculations about what to expect from the immediate future. Yeah, and let's see what kind of surprises awaits us from Russian policy in the Latin America.
Let's see, anything is possible.
Bueno, la guerra, la verdad es que...
Well, war, beyond the analysis and political assessments and different reactions, it is seen in a very worrisome manner, because Latin America is escaping from a very bad economic situation. It was very bad before the pandemic, and it worsened after the pandemic. When they tried to recover, suddenly they suffered this new crisis that really impacts the situation and really slows down the growth of economy, and this will have an impact on Latin America growth with the poverty levels that went back to 2 decades. So we are in 2 decades before the pandemics when dealing with poverty. They are very worried. They are very worried, and the situation tries to find a new way to solve the problems as quick as possible. But there are the losers and the winners of the war. The oil producers in the region, such as Brazil and Mexico, Venezuela for sure, and Colombia, well, those are countries that will take advantage of the increasing level of prices and also the cereal prices. But they will suffer due to the increasing level of prices of fertilizers and other commodities that need to produce other things. So in general terms, it's going to be a very negative effect. Growth is going to be slow, and the inflation installed in all countries will be very big. They are trying to stop the damages, reducing taxes, and trying to stop the energy prices growth. So the impact from an economic perspective is going to be negative, and this probably will have a destabilization consequences domestically speaking. We had loads of demonstrations due to the economic situation, and this will create more polarization and a lack of stability in the region. So it's in something very worrying. Inflation, it's kind of interesting because some sectors, they explain it not due to war, but also due to sanctions imposed by the European Union. Lots of sectors say that it's not the war's fault. It is the sanctions and the European and the US sanctions fault against Russia. So once again, there is this narrative behind the curtains that creates a negative vision of Western countries that is causing and provoking this fatal situation. Some narratives, they say that this war is used by the US, first of all, to get aligned with the European Union and through their positions, and also to weaken the European Union. Thus, there is a negative impact of the European Union in Latin America. So this is a kind of a vision that they have in Latin America, but they also see opportunities. because Russia's will be less influence, will have less influence in Latin America, also US, that it's getting closer to Venezuela. Maybe the US will be able to recover bigger ability to have impacts and to strengthen the relationships with Venezuela and many other countries, and also to reduce the tensions with Cuba, Nicaragua. It's going to be more difficult with Nicaragua, but if there are changes in Cuba and Venezuela, this will never happen before the US elections for sure. But in such a way, after the elections, some of the results, and depending on the evolution, we will see a positive impact. And we will deblock the situation, and the European Union has a CELAC meeting pending, and the Spanish presidency wants to make during his presidency of the CELAC. So maybe we will reduce the tension inside the region, domestically speaking, so we have a positive impacts. Maybe we'll see. There are some possibilities that this will happen. And there is another discourse, or a different narrative, or the liberal discourse, new regimes, democracy doesn't work. I think that this kind of narratives, it's being questioned. So from more, let's say, from more close Russian countries such as Argentina, and obviously Chile, that was not as close to Russia as in the past, they are creating a new discourse. They say we must review the democratic values. I think that war is provoking a revision to know to what extent we can see a trend towards the autocracy, towards the increasing level of autocracy in the region. We can also witness this kind of discourses in Europe. So this will provoke in the sector revision of the progresses of these movements that go against the pillars of democratic principles. And on the other hand, we'll see how media are used, mainly from Russia, right? How Russia is going to use media. We'll have to wait and see. Because, you know, they had a great influence, or quite a strong, not an influence, I'd say. They had quite a great penetration in the region, and probably there will be a bigger surveillance about the role that they played when creating instability in some countries. Yes. And maybe the last comment that I'd like to mention has to do with this idea of soft powers that were deployed. You didn't mention the vaccines, right? And other kind of cooperation. I think that this is going to be weakened in some specific countries that were more open towards Russia, towards this Russian cooperation, and finally they will be more reluctant, and they will make a step backwards while the war is happening. This is my opinion about what could happen. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Anna. What a great perspective, right? So the awareness is growing. It is needed to fight against liberalism as a consequence of Russian aggression in Ukraine. All right. Well, we conclude these keynotes with both members. I think that it has been amazing, very interesting, very fruitful and profitable with data that were shared. So please, now it's up to you. You have the floor. If you want to ask questions, whether you want to add on something, or maybe you want the presenters to talk more in depth about some of the details that have been shared with you, anything, any doubt that you consider useful, please go ahead. Just a second, you need the microphone for translation purposes. just introduce yourself, please. Who are you? I'm Gustavo. I'm a psychologist. And I'm Argentinian. That's why I wanted to ask you something related with Argentina, because I do know my country, obviously. The Argentinian case has some specificities that maybe will be useful to deal with other subjects. We have the president, and another sector, it's more aligned with the US. Just a second, try to speak slowly, because we have translation, all right. Well, not very slowly, a little bit. And there is another side of the government, the vice president, and there is like a socialism, Marxist movement inside the Peronism party, together with Russia. This we witnessed during the pandemic, and it was kind of ridiculous, because the president acquired and bought Moderna or Pfizer vaccines, right? And the president, well, literally said, "Shut up." And she traveled to Russia, and she brought Sputnik vaccines for the Argentinian people. The Russian vaccine. All right. Well, it was a domestic conflict, which is something unique. It is a unique case where the vice president was the one commanding the country, not the president, and it really set the path of this non-liberalism from the vice president. So the concentration, kind of a dictatorship in the hands of the vice president. It's a matter that she will develop if she had more possibilities. And also inside the party, she said, well, let's stop the traditional liberalism. And this is something that we can see in the domestic policy. With money and support. So we also witnessed this in Catalonia, Russian intervention in Catalonia as the main actor to give support to some of the actors of the process while Artur Mas was at power, and Puigdemont through St. Petersburg, boats and fake news, also with AI, and promising that there will be change in the government, and there will be a spot for a naval Russian Navy in the port of Barcelona in almost a coup d'etat that we suffer here in Catalonia. Well, Russia is an international actor, and it plays like an international actor. So my question would be the next one. How do you think, Stanislav and Anna, how do you think that the soft power that Russia has, and maybe not the soft such as the military power, the intelligence power, the cybernetics power, how Russia is playing in the world and in Latin America especially, to give support to non-liberal, non-democratic movements, to give support to these non-democratic movements, whether from the left, from the right, parties. They don't have any problems, as we witness in Catalonia or in Nicaragua or in Venezuela or in Brazil, because they were with Lula, now with Bolsonaro. So any color palette, they don't care. Yes, no prejudices at all. This is my question. Any other questions? Yes? No? I think that there is another question. We do have several questions from the audience following us from home. We have 3 questions. Maybe we can gather together the 3, or maybe you want to answer this first question. Maybe we can answer 2 questions and then 2 other questions. Yes, tell us the second question. The question that it's more similar, the closest question to this on-site question. Yes. Well, Arturo López Levy asks how Europe looks and assesses the abstention of Cuba in the General Assembly of the UN and the call to respect international law beyond Ukraine. I didn't listen very well. Did you listen to the question? Yes, and I do know Arturo Levy. I know the guy that asked the question. So you can answer to the first question, Stanislav, if you don't mind.
Argentine is a very interesting case. And I will reply to your question about how Russia supports this authoritarian backsliding or authoritarian march, which we see in some parts of the world. I was not surprised that Madame Kirchner went to Moscow, not the president, because she built a personal relationship with Putin after the annexation of Crimea, especially. Yeah. And I think she authorized as well Russian television and radio stations in Argentina, RT. I'm not sure about Sputnik radio. I think there is as well application from Argentina to join BRICS. And I wouldn't be very surprised if Russia supports this application. Because in tough times, Russia tries to show that G7 doesn't matter. What matters are the other formats where Russia is a member. And BRICS is one of these examples. Sputnik, it was a big failure of Russian soft power exercise in Latin America. I'm not doctor, I don't know if Sputnik works or not. I'm not sure it was certified by World Health Organization. I'm not sure it was certified by Argentinian authorities, by the way. I think there was a discussion whether to certify or not. But it was failure because Russia didn't have industrial base to produce in big quantities vaccines and deliver to everyone they promised, not only in Latin America, but also in Africa. And that's created some tensions because governments in Latin America needed vaccine now, not in 2 years' time. Russia tried to speculate the crisis, health crisis, to boost its soft power, but I think ultimately it was not very successful. Now, the way Russia uses instruments to support authoritarianism. Loans, arms deliveries, political consultants who help to rig the elections or to win them in the dirty way. And by supporting and helping these regimes to win, they create the new normality. And they create potentially examples which others might copy. Either we'll go as well to Russia and will ask for the same assistance in order to stay in power, or they will ask others to do the same, not necessarily to Russia. So in this way, they change what is normal and what is normal, and not normal. Yeah? If I look to which extent weakened by war, Russia will be able to do this, I think they will be less capable to provide financial assistance, loans. They will need themselves. If you look the budget for 2023 for the next year, probably will be a deficit one, and ministries in Russia operate cuts. I'm not sure about military. As I said, I think Russia will need every helicopter, every artillery piece, everything for their fight in Ukraine. What they can and probably will do if there will be need to provide political consultancy to local regimes. For them it will be entry point to have influence if the person wins, and maybe later to sell their services to others. So I think in many cases Russia doesn't use soft power, but it uses sharp tools to support authoritarianism, to get political influence, and maybe to contribute to authoritarian trend. Because I don't say that Russia is behind the authoritarian trend, but I think they're happy to contribute and to chip in.
Very good. Anna?
Sí, bueno, yo creo que la primera pregunta.
Yes, I think that as for the first question, it was answered by Stanislav. The first question, it's already answered. And obviously, I think that this exercise, Latin America has different processes to de-institutionalize, to put in danger democratic institutions. The most significant case, it's the El Salvador case. They are going towards, let's say, destruction of structures of the rule of law, the democratic rule of law in the country, and this would be approached by Russia, and it is the way that Russia had to get into the region, and this is not going to disappear today in just 24 hours. What will happen is that we will witness if we will be able to overcome this polarization situation and to reach a consensus about the red lines of democratic values. But this is something that Russia is not going to develop. This is something that we must work from the region. I think that now we could have leaders that will work for that, and we do hope that, and we do expect that this will provoke a change. As for Cuba, well, the Cuban question. No one voted against. It could be surprising that Cuba would vote against the resolution, because there were very few countries, none of Latin America voted against the UN resolution. So I do believe that it has been very well valued, positively valued. It is an exercise of, if Cuba is complaining about the interference of the US against Cuba, the normal thing would be not to support the interferences, the clear interference and invasion against other countries. So that's coherent to me. What is true is that if we read the Granma newspaper and many other Cuban publications, we realize that there is kind of a different exercise. They do not want to justify everything, but they want to look for some explanations about the NATO position. And they are making guilty NATO aggressivity, and because they are able to interfere in some domestic affairs or Russian affairs. What's quite funny, because they are saying no to the influence space of the US, but they are respecting the Russian influence geography and space. So, well, that's the position that we can see in Cuba. And suddenly they will discover that there is a contradiction amongst the terms, and also there is a contradiction in ethics. I hope that they will see that. Yes, the other two questions. Do we have more questions? We do have another question in the room, and we do have two other questions. So let's answer to the three questions, because we only have 12 minutes. Okay, brilliant. Can you hear me well? I'm Natalia. I'm Argentinian as well. My question is more specific, always related with the region. Do you consider that in Argentina, taking into account that next year we will have presidential elections, if we will change towards the right-wing parties with the candidates such as Milei or Patricio Ulrichs, representative of Juntos por el Cambio, maybe this will have an impact on the approximation towards Russian, that it's materialized for the Argentinian addition to the BRICS, and also the SEA initiative and other international initiatives. The first question is from Mike Tyser, and he asks, taking into account the long dependency of these countries, the Ukraine war has an impact on the survival of authoritarian regimes in Cuba, Nicaragua, or Venezuela. And the third question by Julia Riera, correspondent of La Voz de America newspaper. The first question is, do you see an influence of Russia as a threat to international status quo, and the narrow relationship between Nicaragua and Russia, talking about military, will produce a situation like in Cuba in the 50s? And the isolation of Nicaragua? Stanislav, maybe you can answer.
Look, I will address questions maybe from Russian perspective. I don't follow local politics in Argentine. I'm looking from perspective of Russian policy, their interests. I'm sure that Russia would be happy to invest in a new relationship with anyone who will be in Argentina. Of course, they have this relationship with Madame Kirchner, but Russia proved to be a very pragmatic actor. When someone loses and another wins, they quite often were adaptable to build the relationship with a winner. For instance, the good example is with Egypt. Yeah? There was Muslim Brotherhood.
Yes.
and Russia was quite able to build a strong relationship or normal relationship with them. When military removed them, Russia was able to build this military relationship with President Assisi. So they're quite adaptable. Yeah? Then about dependencies in Latin America, Cuba, Venezuela. I think in case of Venezuela, there is attempt to make them less dependent or rely less on Russia. These discussions between US and Venezuela and allow them to export certain quantities of oil, I think is moving in that direction. I have not followed this issue, whether it was a further progress, but I think much weaker financially and militarily Russia will make their clients to diversify their international engagements. It was good to benefit from loans and assistance from Russia. I think it was done not out of love, but out of very pragmatic interests. The moment Russia cannot do it, I think they will be looking for alternative clients, patrons, sorry, for alternative patrons, without burning bridges with Russia. Yeah? Even probably making very enthusiastic statements about how close the relationship with Russia, but at the same way building bridges with other big regional powers. So I wouldn't be surprised. And I think the less is a threat for Maduro to be removed violently, the less he needs Russia. Yeah? The more oil he can sell on the international market, the less he will need Russia. Yeah? Whether it will happen, I don't know, in terms of whether we'll be able to sell more oil. But in terms of political stabilization, he was very dependent on Russia in very critical juncture when there were protests and some violence. Now on Nicaragua, repetition of the 50s. I don't think Russia will be able to reproduce the crisis we have seen during the Cold War around Cuban missiles. Russia sometimes is engaged in the Cold War policies or behavior, but it's only the copy of Soviet Union policy. Russia doesn't have resources of Soviet Union, and it's not a bipolar world. There are other actors, significant, influential on the international stage. World is much more diversified and balanced than it was at that time, when two superpowers managed to accumulate big resources and big alliances as well. What I wouldn't rule out that Russia will try to do these symbolic visits to send the message to Washington. To park closer somewhere in Nicaragua and battleship for several days or weeks, to have flights of strategic bombers. But as I said, I think main Russian military thrust will go to Ukraine. And whatever we will try to do in other regions, it will be largely symbolic. More to this, and to conclude, probably we will see withdrawal of Russian military presence from other parts of the world.
Absolutely.
We have seen that they moved recently S-300 air defense systems from Syria to Ukraine. We have seen as well Russia moving some paratroopers from Syria to Ukraine. There is nothing to move from Latin America, but it gives you a kind of a perspective that they are militarily overstretched. They are moving some troops from other regions to Ukraine, and it's unlikely that they will have any big military presence in Latin America in the coming months or years. I think militarily they will be pretty weak in conventional terms, when it's about ground troops, tanks, but still they are nuclear superpower, and they're gonna try to play this card hard.
Thank you, Stan. Anna, por favor.
Sí. Bueno,
Yes, as for the Argentinian question, I think that I answered before this question. Inside the government, there is not an unanimous position while dealing with the Russian alignment, and I think that the position is going to be very pragmatic, whether from this government, so well from the future governments. We are very far away to know how the elections and the results will be. If the right parties win, I think the positions to get closer to Russia will be more moderated, they will be freezed. So let's make a distinction between Russia and China, because something has to do with the Russian relationship. They can be in the freezer, and the other relationship will be with China, where the interests are higher and where the influence and the ability of China is higher as well, right? Argentina is not going to say no to Chinese trade. That's crystal clear. If China offers investments for any kind of exploitations, and they will say yes. In reality, China took some investments that Russia tried to have in some Argentinian regions, mainly for oil exploitation, and it was taken by China. So in the end, so China and Russia, they are competitors in Latin America. So we have a relationship towards Russia, and also we do have the BRICS, and also the stripe, the so-called franja, the stripe, and also the Silk Road, which are projects that are more economic investment projects where we can see a much more pragmatic vision. As for the previous topic you already mentioned, Russia never had a military presence. It is used as a provocation against the US. They want only to provoke. And I think that it's going to be witnessed and weakened because they cannot offer anything. You said before, and someone asked about it. Basically, Russian funds to help Venezuela were related with intelligence and security. But never they had the military presence in Venezuela. Yes, they sold arms that they won't have to export because Russia needs these arms and weapons. Beyond that, Venezuela cannot pay for the Russian arms. But it was not a financial help what was offered by Russia. The financial help towards Venezuela has come from China. So nowadays circumstances, the dependency and the Venezuelan influence towards Russia is going to be weakened, as you said before. And the ones that have sanctions is Russia. So it's going to be useless as a tool, as a way to evade sanctions, Venezuelan sanctions, because this is what Russia offered, how to be more resilient against sanctions. So Cuba knows very well, because they suffered many times. So in the level of dependency of Cuba, it's lower towards Russia, and Cuba is looking for other allies. But Cuba, any step forward to get closer to the US, it's more important than getting closer to Russia. It is a strategic ally from a geopolitical perspective, but economically it's a very marginal. I think that we have more questions, right? Do we have more questions? No. Sorry to interrupt you. Well, I think that I concluded, right? I answered to the three questions. Nicaragua, well, they will use it. I don't know. It's a mutual use. Russia is using Nicaragua for not being isolated, and Nicaragua is the same, right? The relationships with Russia, they are very helpful to show that despite the sanctions, from the Western countries' sanctions perspective, despite the sanctions and the criticism, they have some allies, and those allies give them support. They have international support, and they are not domestically isolated. So this is something reciprocal. This is a mutual help. Well, that's all. I think that I answered to the three questions, more or less. Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you very much, Stanislav. We are closing, and it's time to finish, I think that it was great. What a very complete perspective, very fruitful conversation. I think that you all, you both showed that this idea that it's repeated many times by Putin and the Kremlin, it's trying to take care of, that says that despite that the Western countries, therefore, despite us, despite that they are isolated, they are not isolated from the other parts of the world, because the world it's bigger than the Western side. As the foreign ministry spokesperson said, Western countries, how care about Western countries? The world it's bigger, Latin America, Africa, Asia, right? They are with us, they are giving us support, and we have amazing trade and economic relationships with them, right? Obviously, today's situation, it's weakening, and at least, it's not as obvious, it's very unstable, as you both said with the Latin American case, as it has been shown in the Samarkand meeting, where Putin had to wait instead of him waiting for the others waiting for Putin. The big international actors such as China and India, the way, in a very diplomatic manner, the way they say things, they made Putin know that, hey, my dear friend, try to put some order domestically because you're going towards a disaster. And we don't need disasters today. This is what China and India, I mean, plainly speaking, maybe they have other questions and other narratives, but I do believe that the Kremlin, it's very aware that this international scenario, that Putin thought that it was, safe enough. Nowadays, it's showing some leaks and leakages, and today's Putin's speech about militarization, and mainly, I do believe, about being so stubborn and pretending that they are ready to go till the end using nuclear weapons. So this is undermining his power. Thank you very much for being with us today, and see you next time. Thank you.